Flames of salvation. The cargo ship's landing gear groaned as it settled onto the frost-covered pad. Riker Voss watched through the viewport as ice crystals scattered in the engine wash, his weathered face illuminated by the ship's dim emergency lights. This moon, Narova, wasn't on any regular trade routes. It was a forgotten rock orbiting a gas giant no one cared about in a system most navigation charts simply marked as minimal resources. Perfect for a man who preferred to be forgotten. Riker ran through the shutdown sequence with practiced efficiency, each movement automatic after 15 years of piloting. The manifest listed simple supplies, nutrient blocks, water filters, and basic medical kits, to be delivered to the native settlement 2 kilometers east. The payment was meager, barely covering fuel costs, but that wasn't why he'd taken this contract. Remote drops meant no questions, no paperwork, and most importantly, no one looking too closely at the man making the delivery. He pulled on his thermal jacket and strapped the plasma cutter to his thigh, not technically a weapon, but it would serve if needed. 10 years since he'd left military service, since the massacre on Vega Prime that still haunted his dreams, and he still couldn't go planetside unarmed. The air bit at his lungs when he stepped outside, crisp and thin. Narova's atmosphere was breathable but barely, the kind that left your chest aching after an hour's exposure. The settlement coordinates pulsed on his wrist display, but something else caught his attention, a distant glow through the twisted trees, accompanied by rhythmic sounds that carried across the frozen landscape. Drums. Ancient and primal. Riker hesitated. The smart move was to complete the delivery and leave. That's what he was paid for, not to investigate strange lights or sounds. Not to get involved. But the drumbeats pulled at something inside him, something he thought he'd buried years ago. Without fully deciding to, he found himself moving toward the glow, away from his ship and into the forest of bone-white trees. The drums grew louder as he approached, accompanied now by chanting. He crouched at the edge of a clearing and what he saw froze his blood colder than Narova's atmosphere. A circle of fire surrounded a central pit where flames leapt 10 meters high. Around this inferno, figures moved in synchronized patterns, their bodies painted with luminescent symbols that pulsed in time with the drums. They wore elaborate headdresses made from what appeared to be ship parts and bone, their faces hidden behind masks carved from iridescent wood. But it was what hung suspended above the flames that seized Riker's attention. She was stretched between 2 towering stone pillars, arms extended and secured with bindings that cut into her wrists. Her skin was a pale violet that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light, marked with intricate patterns that might have been ritual paint or natural markings. Her hair, long and flowing with an almost silver quality, hung in tangled waves around a face of alien beauty. Not human, but unmistakably person. Her eyes were closed, head slumped forward as if unconscious or resigned, but as Riker watched, she raised her face toward the night sky. Even at this distance, he could see the intelligence in those eyes, large, almond-shaped, with pupils that reflected the firelight like mirrors. This wasn't a religious icon or effigy. This was a living, thinking being prepared for sacrifice. A tall figure approached the central fire pit, adorned with more elaborate decorations than the others. The elder, Riker guessed, or whatever passed for tribal leadership here. The drumming intensified as the figure raised a ceremonial blade that caught the firelight, and the chanting reached a fever pitch. No, Riker whispered, the word escaping before he could stop it. The elder turned toward the central fire, blade raised toward the suspended figure. Something about her posture changed, not struggle, but awareness, a final dignity in the face of death. And then she looked directly at Riker, as if she'd known he was there all along. Their eyes met across the clearing, and a sensation like an electric current shot through his mind, not words, not exactly, but understanding. terror, pain, and underneath it all, a desperate will to live. He had no plan, no backup, and absolutely no business interfering with what was clearly a deeply embedded cultural practice. The Federation protocols were explicit: non-interference with indigenous rituals, even when those rituals involved sacrifice. Riker had already broken enough laws in his lifetime. One more wouldn't matter. He moved without further thought, hand finding the plasma cutter at his thigh. The weapon hummed to life with a distinctive sound that cut through the chanting. By the time the first tribal member turned toward him, he was already halfway to the central fire. "Stop!" The elder's voice boomed across the clearing in heavily accented standard, surprising Riker. "Sacred ceremony. Off-worlder has no place." Riker didn't slow. "She's not yours to kill." The first spear flew past his head, embedding itself in the frozen ground behind him. The second would have found its mark if he hadn't ducked, the military training he'd tried to forget taking over. He rolled, came up running, and reached the edge of the central platform. The heat was intense, scorching his face and lungs. The suspended figure's eyes widened as he approached, a mix of disbelief and something else, recognition, though they'd never met. Two tribal guards moved to intercept him, ceremonial weapons raised. Riker didn't hesitate. The plasma cutter sliced through the first guard's spear, the superheated edge cauterizing the wound it left in the man's shoulder. The second guard fell back, shouting in a language Riker's translator couldn't parse. More were coming. He had seconds, not minutes. Riker leapt onto the platform, the intense heat making his skin blister instantly. He swung the plasma cutter upward, slicing through the bindings that held the alien woman suspended. She collapsed into his arms, lighter than he expected despite her height, her skin cool against his despite the surrounding inferno. She didn't struggle or cry out. Instead, her arms wrapped around his neck, face pressing against his chest as if seeking shelter from a storm. The sensation in his mind intensified: gratitude, fear, urgency. "Hold on," he muttered, turning toward the edge of the clearing furthest from the gathered tribe. The night erupted into chaos. Spears and primitive projectiles flew around them as Riker ran, the woman clutched against his chest. Something struck his shoulder, sending a searing pain down his arm, but he didn't slow. The forest edge seemed impossibly distant, the drumbeats behind them transforming into war cries. They broke through the tree line, branches whipping at their faces as Riker plunged deeper into the shadowed forest. His lungs burned from the exertion and the thin atmosphere, but stopping meant death, for both of them. "Need to find shelter," he gasped, glancing down at the figure in his arms. Her eyes met his, luminous in the darkness. "There," she whispered, the word barely audible, pointing toward a ridge of dark stone rising from the forest floor. Riker changed direction, following her guidance. The ridge revealed itself to be a series of weathered rock formations, and at their base, a narrow opening that might have been carved by water centuries ago. It was barely visible in the darkness, the kind of shelter a hunted creature might seek. He ducked inside, laying the woman gently on the smooth stone floor before collapsing beside her, breath coming in ragged gasps. The shelter was shallow but offered protection from three sides, and the opening was narrow enough to defend if necessary. For several minutes, neither spoke. Riker checked his wound, superficial but painful, a jagged cut where something had sliced through his jacket. The bleeding had already slowed in the cold air. Finally, when his breathing steadied, he turned to look at his companion. Up close, her alienness was more pronounced. The violet skin had a faint pattern of lighter markings along her temples and throat, and what he'd taken for ritual paint was actually a network of luminescent veins that pulsed softly beneath her skin. Her eyes, now that he could see them properly, contained galaxies, pupils like shattered glass reflecting starlight. "Why?" she asked, her voice musical despite its weakness. "Why save enemy?" Riker shook his head. "You're not my enemy. To them. Sacred. To you, nothing." Her words were halting but clear, her command of standard surprising. Why risk? It was a good question, one Riker hadn't fully answered for himself when he charged into that clearing. He reached into his pack, pulled out a water container, and offered it to her. She drank carefully, small sips that spoke of training or discipline. When she finished, she handed it back with a gesture that seemed almost formal. "I've watched people die before," Riker said finally. "Stood by when I shouldn't have. Not doing that again." She studied him, head tilted slightly. "You, soldier once." It wasn't a question. Riker tensed. "How did you feel it?" she said, tapping her temple. "Here. My people sense thoughts. Not words. Feelings. Telepathic." That explained the sensations he'd felt when their eyes met across the clearing. It also complicated things considerably. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, then touched her chest. "Lyra." "You." "Riker. Riker Voss." He hesitated, then asked, "What were they going to do to you?" Lyra's luminescence dimmed slightly. "Consume. My kind energy beings. They believe eating brings power." She gestured to the markings on her skin. "Life force. Sacred meal." Riker felt sick. "How did you end up here?" "Taken. Ship attacked, sold here." Her eyes darkened with memory. "Third world sold to. First was mining. Second was, worse." The familiar anger kindled in Riker's chest, the same rage that had gotten him court-martialed and discharged after he'd turned his weapon on his own commanding officer when the man had ordered civilian settlements purged on Vega Prime. "We need to rest," he said, pushing the anger down. "They'll be hunting us come morning." Lyra nodded, pulling her knees to her chest. "Cold," she said simply. Riker removed his jacket and offered it to her. She accepted it with apparent surprise, wrapping it around her shoulders. The gesture seemed to affect her deeply, as if simple kindness was unfamiliar. "Sleep," he said. "I'll keep watch." She studied him for a long moment, those starlit eyes seeming to see through him. Then, slowly, deliberately, she reached out and touched his hand, a gesture so unexpected that Riker nearly pulled away. "Connected now," she said softly. "We'll know, if danger comes." With that, she curled onto her side, still wearing his jacket, and closed her eyes. Within minutes, her breathing had steadied into sleep, the luminescent patterns on her skin pulsing gently like a heartbeat. Riker leaned back against the cold stone, plasma cutter ready across his knees. Outside, Narova's night wind howled through the twisted trees, carrying the distant sound of drums that hadn't ceased. He'd broken planetary law, interfered with indigenous customs, and made enemies of an entire settlement. By morning, he'd be a hunted man with nowhere to go except off-world, if he could reach his ship. And yet, watching the gentle rise and fall of Lyra's chest as she slept, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. Beyond the stars. Dawn on Narova didn't arrive with gentle light, but rather a gradual lessening of darkness. The sky shifted from black to a deep, bruised purple, casting long shadows through the twisted trees. Riker hadn't slept. His back ached from sitting against the stone wall, but he'd maintained his vigil through the night, listening to the distant sounds of pursuit that had grown closer with each passing hour. Lyra stirred before the light fully changed, her movements graceful despite her weakened state. The luminescence beneath her skin had strengthened overnight, pulsing with a steady rhythm that seemed to match her heartbeat. "They search," she said without preamble, her eyes finding his in the dim light. "Getting closer." Riker nodded. "I know. We need to move." He checked his wrist display. "My ship is 7 kilometers northwest. If we can reach it." "Cannot," Lyra interrupted, shaking her head. "They watch ship. First place they look." She was right, of course. It would be the most obvious target, and Riker wasn't naive enough to think the tribal hunters were primitive in their thinking, despite their ceremonial appearance. "You know this place," he said. "Where can we go?" Lyra rose to her feet, still wrapped in his jacket despite the fact that she stood nearly a head taller than him when fully upright. She moved to the entrance of their shelter, peering out at the lightning landscape. "Old station," she said after a moment. 3 ridges east. Abandoned. Tribal people avoid, believe spirits haunt it." "And does it have spirits?" Riker asked, only half joking. Lyra's lips curved slightly, the first hint of a smile he'd seen. "Only memories. Bad ones." She knew the place, then. Something in his expression must have revealed his question, because she added, "Second place I was sold to. Before here." Riker gathered his few supplies, checking the charge on his plasma cutter. "Half power, enough for defense, but not for sustained fighting. They would need to be careful." They moved like shadows through the forest, Lyra leading with surprising surety. Despite her ordeal, she navigated the terrain with ease, occasionally reaching out to steady Riker when the ground became treacherous. Each time their skin made contact, Riker felt that same strange connection, fleeting impressions, emotions that weren't his own. "You're getting stronger," he observed during a brief rest. Lyra nodded. "My kind regenerate quickly. When not." She paused, searching for the word. "Harvested." The implied history in that single word made Riker's jaw tighten. "The people who held you at this station we're heading to, they're gone now." "Yes." "Raid. Different tribe." Her expression darkened. "Many died. I escaped in chaos. Found by Fire Tribe 3 cycles later." They continued in silence, moving faster as Lyra's strength returned. Twice they had to hide as tribal hunting parties passed nearby, their bodies painted for war rather than ceremony now. Each time, Lyra sensed them before they came into view, pulling Riker into cover with a touch that communicated urgency without words. By midday, they reached the first of the 3 ridges, climbing carefully up the rocky slope. At the crest, Riker paused, looking back the way they had come. In the distance, columns of smoke rose from the tribal settlement, signal fires, he guessed, coordinating the search. "They won't stop," he said. "Not after what I did." Lyra stood beside him, her gaze following his. "Sacred law broken. Blood debt." She turned to look at him, those star-filled eyes solemn. "You should have left me." "No," Riker said simply. "I shouldn't have." Something passed between them in that moment, understanding deeper than words. Lyra reached out, hesitated, then gently touched his face. The connection bloomed instantly, stronger than before. Not just impressions now, but memories, flashes of light, the sensation of falling, pain, fear, and beneath it all, a deep loneliness that matched his own. "Bound now," she whispered. "Life debt." My people never forget. They made their way down the far side of the ridge, the terrain growing steeper and more difficult. Lyra moved with increasing confidence, occasionally producing sounds that seemed to echo strangely off the rocks around them, using some form of echolocation to guide their path. As they crossed a narrow ravine, Riker finally asked the question that had been building since their escape. "What are you, Lyra? Your people, what are they called?" She was silent for several steps, negotiating a difficult portion of the path before answering. "Luminare," she said. "From Eridani system. We are few now. Hunted. Valued. For your abilities?" Lyra nodded. "Telepathic. Healing. Energy manipulation." She glanced at him. "Some fear us. Some worship. Some consume. And your family?" Her luminescence dimmed noticeably. "Gone. Research vessel attacked 8 cycles ago. Parents were scientists. Brother too. I was apprentice navigator." It explained her confidence in the wilderness, her ability to find their way through unfamiliar terrain. Navigators on research vessels were trained for planetary exploration, often dropped on unknown worlds to chart safe passages. "I'm sorry," Riker said. They reached the second ridge by late afternoon, the purple sky darkening again as Narova's brief day cycle began to wane. From their elevated position, they could see the abandoned station Lyra had mentioned, a collection of low, bunker-like structures nestled against the third ridge, partially collapsed but still recognizable as human-made. "Empire outpost," Lyra explained. "Mining operation. Failed when or proved toxic." Riker studied the structures. "How long until we reach it?" "Before dark. If we—" She stopped suddenly, head tilting as if listening. Riker tensed, hand moving to his weapon. "What is it?" "Hunters," she whispered. "Close. Different path, but converging." They had no choice but to continue forward, moving with greater caution now. The forest had thinned, offering less cover as they approached the final ridge. Twice they had to freeze in place as distant figures crossed their path, tribal hunters scanning the landscape with surprising technical equipment alongside their primitive weapons. The sun was setting when they finally reached the abandoned station, slipping through a partially collapsed doorway into the cool darkness of the interior. Riker activated a small light, revealing a space that had once been some kind of processing center. Dust covered everything, but the structure was sound, and more importantly, defensible. "We should be safe here for the night," Riker said, securing the entrance as best he could. "Tomorrow we'll need to figure out how to reach my ship." Lyra moved deeper into the structure, her natural luminescence providing enough light to see by. She ran her fingers along the wall, pausing at a control panel that had long since lost power. "Memories here," she said softly. "Not all bad." Riker found emergency rations in an old storage locker, expired, but still sealed and likely safe. He offered some to Lyra, who accepted with a grateful nod. As they ate in companionable silence, Riker found himself studying her more openly. The alien beauty that had first struck him in the firelight was different now, less otherworldly, more real. Her movements were precise, efficient, yet carried a grace that suggested her species evolved for purposes beyond mere survival. "Why did you leave the military?" she asked suddenly. The question caught him off guard. "How did you feel it?" she said, tapping her head. "Strong memory. Pain." Riker stared into the darkness beyond their small circle of light. He'd never spoken of Vega Prime, not to anyone. Even his discharge papers had been carefully worded to avoid the full truth of what had happened there. My unit was assigned to pacify a settlement, he said finally, the words coming slowly. Suspected insurgents. Our orders were to make an example. No survivors. Lyra was perfectly still, listening. There were no insurgents, he continued. Just families. Children. I refused the order. My commanding officer decided to proceed anyway. Riker's hand tightened around the ration bar. I stopped him. Permanently. You saved lives, Lyra said. Not enough. The old guilt rose like bile. They sent another unit after they arrested me. Completed the mission. 3,000 civilians. Gone. Lyra moved closer, her luminescence brightening slightly. Cannot save everyone. But you tried. She hesitated, then added, like with me. Their eyes met in the dim light, and Riker felt the connection between them strengthen again, not invasive, but supportive, as if she were deliberately sharing her strength with him. I was court-martialed, he said. Dishonorable discharge. Would have been execution, but the tribunal was divided. Some thought I'd done the right thing, couldn't say it openly. And after? Drifted. Took odd jobs. Eventually scraped together enough for a used cargo ship. Been running deliveries to places like this ever since. Places where questions aren't asked. Lyra was silent for a long moment. Then, with deliberate movements, she removed something from a hidden pocket in her tattered clothing, a small device, roughly cylindrical, with faint markings etched into its surface. Navigator beacon, she explained, holding it out to him. Still functional. Can signal luminare vessels, if any survive. Riker stared at the device. You've had this all along. Why didn't you use it before? Range limited. Needed height, clear sky. She gestured upward. And hope. Lost that. Until now. The implications were clear. She'd been resigned to her fate until he'd intervened, had given up any thought of rescue or escape. We'll find a way to activate it, he promised. Get you home. Lyra's expression shifted, became more intense. Home gone. But people, perhaps still exist. Scattered. Hiding. She leaned forward slightly. Riker Voss. What will you do? After? It was a question he hadn't considered. Before Narova, before Lyra, his life had been a series of cargo runs and empty spaces between stars, each day indistinguishable from the last. A slow form of penance, perhaps, or just existence without purpose. I don't know, he admitted. Come with me, she said, the word simple but carrying weight. My debt. Your new path. Before he could respond, a sound from outside caught their attention, voices, distant but approaching. The tribal hunters had found their trail. Riker was on his feet instantly, plasma cutter in hand. Back door. Another way out. Lyra shook her head. One entrance. Defensive position. They moved deeper into the structure, finding a room that had once been some kind of communications center. Equipment long dead lined the walls, but the space had only one entry point, defensible, but also a potential trap. If they find us here. Riker began. They will, Lyra said with certainty. Question is when. She moved to a console, ran her fingers over the dead controls, then closed her eyes. To Riker's astonishment, the luminescence beneath her skin intensified, flowing down her arms into her fingertips, where it seemed to sink into the machinery. A soft hum filled the room as dormant systems struggled to life, not fully powered, but responding to whatever energy Lyra was channeling into them. "What are you doing?" Riker whispered. "Trying to access." Her face was a mask of concentration. "Emergency protocols." A screen flickered weakly to life, displaying corrupted data in a script Riker couldn't read. Lyra's fingers moved across the console, her luminescence pulsing in time with the changing displays. "Found it," she said after several tense minutes. "Distress beacon. Still functional." "You're going to call for help?" Riker asked skeptically. "From who?" Lyra's smile was grim. "Not help. Distraction." Outside, the voices had grown louder. They had minutes, perhaps less. With a final surge of luminescence that left her noticeably dimmer, Lyra activated the station's emergency systems. A low, pulsing alarm began to sound, and red warning lights flickered to life throughout the structure. "Toxic contamination warning," she explained. "Automatic in mining facilities. Even tribal people recognize it."